Hello and welcome to another episode of Project Stargate. I'm your host, Mark Brenner. Today we have Pam Nance with us. She is a parapsychologist, an anthropologist, archaeologist. She's been a paranormal researcher and consciousness researcher for about 40 years. Pam is she's worked with MUFON from time to time, Rhine, and other paranormal organizations. She is She's also an acquaintance of Kathleen Martin, who we had on as a guest here on our show a couple of months ago. Without further ado, Pamela, I'd like to thank you for being with us on Project Stargate and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here. I appreciate you having me on today.
Yes, ma'am. Pam, so just for our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about your background as far as your educational background and why you got into these fields of paranormal research?
Sure. After experiencing a lot of different levels of consciousness beginning in childhood and throughout my early adulthood and into my current life, I, over time, decided to formalize my interest as a paranormal investigator, and that led me to study ufology, consciousness, quantum theory. But early on, I was very interested in the history of our planet and religion and sociology. And so I formalized those interests in obtaining degrees, my master's degree in cultural anthropology and archaeology, and undergraduate degrees in sociology and religion, just in an effort to understand the history of mankind on the planet, as well as the fossil record and how our history fit into the fossil record. And that gave me a very broad understanding of the cultural background of humankind on Earth, as well as a historic perspective. And I was able to incorporate all of that knowledge into my studies into consciousness.
Wow. In our conversation previously, you were telling me about you've started having experiences much like I have and many others have, and towards your early childhood. Just for our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about that and the history of how things went down during your childhood and early adult years?
Sure. Well, to give you a little perspective in I think what influenced my consciousness, I come from a maternal line of American Cherokee Indian, as well as Spanish Basque, that began with my great-great-grandmother, who was full-blooded Cherokee, as well as a grandmother on my paternal side that was Spanish Basque. And so there was a healing maternal line that came down, beginning with my great-great-grandmother. She and my great-great-aunts were healers, root doctors, midwives. They took care of the children in the neighborhood. If any of them were injured or had burns, they had the ability to lay hands and heal. And so as a young child, I heard those stories, coming from my aunts and my mother and my grandmother. And my mom was always very open to spirit and intuition and psychic dreams. And so I was raised in a household that was, she didn't shut those things down in me as a child, because I guess beginning around the age of 5, I found that I was quite different from other children. I had the ability to bilocate out of my body. And I did this primarily out back of my home as I looked at a nearby mountain. It's called Pilot Mountain. And I would sit and gaze at that mountain, and I was able to bilocate out of my body and almost fly. If I felt like a bird, I could see the lay of the land and the tops of the trees and the hills, and go to that mountain, circle around, and come back. And I shared that with my mom, and she, she didn't shut me down. She just said, that's, interesting, but it's probably something you don't want to talk about outside the home. But she didn't discourage me from doing that. And I had that ability from, I guess, about the ages of 5 until 9. And I mentioned the mountain because it's a very significant spiritual place for the Native Americans that lived in this area for about 1,000 years, the Sara Indians. And they actually called it Jomioki, or the Great Guide. And the mountain is a dormant volcano that is part of the, like a million-year-old Rodina Ridge. It's sort of the end of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But it's a very spiritual place to the American Indians. But it's also important in sacred geometry. It's referred to as the pilot wheel. And the energy grid comes from the intersection of 2 very important ley lines. We have the serpent ley that comes across the United States from south of Mount Denali, north of Mount Shasta, down across the United States, across Serpent Mound. It crosses over the top of Pilot Mountain and extends out to the Bermuda Triangle. And then we have the Acadian ley that comes up from Mexico City up through the southern United States, across Georgia into North Carolina, and directly over Pilot Mountain and out to Stonehenge. So we have the intersection of these 2 very important ley lines, the Serpent Ley and the Acadian ley, over the top of Pilot Mountain. Well, the home that I grew up in is on the edge of that pilot wheel. There's a large circle of energy that radiates out from that mountain. And the area that I grew up in is within that wheel of energy. And the home is also located over an artesian river, an underground river, which within sacred geometry also creates an enormous amount of energy. It's a geostream that runs underground. So I think those 2 ley lines combined with the artesian river set that property up for a lot of electromagnetic energy. And for those that are able to tap into, higher consciousness, an area that would be conducive to that type of thinking. So, coming from the maternal line of Basque and Cherokee, and then having this open-minded mom, I wasn't shut down. And so I was able to utilize the energy coming not only through my bloodline, but also from the property itself. And I think that is what helped the bilocation. But then I had additional things occur on the property. When I was 10 years old, I was in my bedroom one night. The school year was coming to a close. It was probably May. And this would have been in May of 1960, I guess 67. I would have turned 11 that following November. But I was lying in bed, and these 2 humanoid beings appeared by my bedside. They were dressed in black turtlenecks, black pants. There was a male and a female. The male had hair, light brown hair about down to his shoulders. The female had hair below her shoulders and bangs. They were very handsome people, very good looking people with chiseled features. but their eyes were bigger than humans. They weren't the size of like the gray aliens, but they were larger than humans. But if they had sunglasses on and you passed them on a city street, you wouldn't think that they weren't human.
So they could pass as human.
Yes, they could.
Definitely. Okay.
Other than the eyes. But they stood over me, and the male held a giant timepiece. And he said, as this timepiece clicks down 60 seconds to back around to 12, we're going to take you. And so I watched this giant timepiece click down 60 seconds, and I found myself being floated out of my bedroom, through my bedroom window, to being on board a craft. I don't recall seeing the craft or actually physically entering the craft, but I felt the sensation of being floated. And then I found myself on board the craft lying on a table. And what they communicated to me, and it was telepathic communication, and you hear that a lot, that, you know, there aren't any spoken words, that it's telepathic, that they were there to rebalance my karma for the beheading of a sacred white elephant that I had committed in a past life 5,000 years before. And this karma had followed me throughout my lifetimes, and they wanted to get rid of that karma. And so they were there as a goodwill gesture to rebalance. And I found that they were working above my head. I could not see what they were doing, but I had the sense that they were working in my head area. But I can tell you, as a 10-year-old Southern Baptist girl raised in the Northwest Piedmont area of North Carolina, I knew nothing about any sacred white elephants, or which would have, you know, implied the Hindu religion. I knew nothing about that. So the fact that that information was imparted to me, you know, is pretty relevant. I think that this was an actual occurrence and not something that I had imagined. The next thing I recall, I'm back in my bed, and I think that they have beheaded me. And because I think in my 10-year-old mind, I got confused from them imparting the information about this past life and the fact that I felt they were working in my head area, but I thought I'd been beheaded. And I was frantic.
Ouch.
Yeah, it was very terrifying. You know, I was crying. I was inconsolable. My family members, you know, tried to assure me I had my head. And even though I was talking to them, I thought my head was missing. It was horrible. It was a horrible thing. And it took hours to settle me down. But the interesting thing, about 2 days later, I awoke, and I had my entire head from the neck up was bright red, almost like a really fine rash. And my parents took me to the doctor. The doctor could not, you know, come up with an explanation for what was going on, but he, you know, prescribed some type of topical cream. And I was out of school for about 2 weeks. I almost missed the end of the school year, just because of this, you know, redness over the entire head area. And it wasn't until I, you know, became older that I connected that physical event to what occurred on the ship. And perhaps I was exposed to something while on board the craft that caused this redness, almost like a radiation burn. But I was an adult before I made that association. But I had PTSD from that event for about 15 years. Anytime the same lighting in my bedroom was recreated, I would go right back to that event. And PTSD is a horrible thing. If you've never experienced it, you can't explain how that feels, but it was pretty frightening.
I'd like to interject just for
Sure.
real quick, if you don't mind, Pam. You made a really good point on PTSD. It doesn't matter how you acquired it, whether it was in combat or if it was from any kind of experience that was traumatic at the level you're describing. It doesn't matter. PTSD is very serious. And I just wanted my listeners to know, if you do think you may have post traumatic stress, please get help. Continue, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, in a way, the PTSD from that event, uh, fast forwarding to the paranormal work that I did, helped me actually go to these haunted locations and not be afraid of anything. I've always thought if I survived that event as a 10-year-old child, nothing that I encounter at one of these historic haunted sites is going to scare me. So in a way, it was beneficial, but it was very traumatic for about 15 years until I fully understood, what had actually occurred. But after that event, I guess it was just maybe a month later, I was on the front porch of my home with my parents. It was a summer evening. School was out. It was not yet dark. We were sitting out on the porch, enjoying the evening air after dinner. My mom and dad, myself, my baby brother, and an older brother. When suddenly my little 5-year-old baby brother said, "Look," and he pointed across the road to a silver disc that was sitting above these scrub pine trees, not that far away and not that high above the trees. And of course, we all became very excited. We stood up, ran out in the yard. We were pointing, talking about, this spaceship. And it was just sitting there, making no noise, just hovering above these trees. And in the blink of an eye, it shot from east to west. And what's interesting about that is that the westward direction would have been towards Pilot Mountain, that same mountain that I referenced earlier, a direct shot towards that mountain. So that was just about a month or so after my abduction experience. And I don't know if it was the same craft, that I'd been aboard previously, but myself and my family saw it. So I had eyewitnesses to that event. But a lot of occurrences as a child of thinking that I was having dreams of being out in the yard at night and seeing craft in the sky and bright lights coming down like they were looking for me. And I can remember hiding like behind trees and trying to get away from these bright lights, but not being able to escape. And I always would think, oh no, here we go again. I would have that thought. And then I would wake up the next morning thinking, gee, I had that dream again. And this happened over and over as a kid. But I always thought they were dreams. But of course, as an adult, and I explored, the subject further, I realized that, they were probably actual encounters. But one night in particular, around this same period of being 10, 11, 12 years of age, my dad got up, he would get up at night and check on us kids, and I wasn't in bed. So he went outside and he found me under this particular tree. It's a big red cedar tree that's about 150 years old. And that's also the same tree I would often hide behind when these lights were trying to get me. He found me under that cedar tree, unconscious, brought me inside. And I think they were to the point of like getting ready to take me to the hospital. They had even gone next door and got a good friend of theirs that lived next door, an elderly man, to come down. And I came to, and my entire family's looking at me and the neighbor. And it was probably about 11 o'clock. And they, were asking me questions. What happened? How do you feel? And I remembered what happened. I remembered I was hiding from that craft, from that bright light. But I had all these people staring at me. And I was embarrassed, and I just said, nothing happened. I don't remember. But I did remember, the craft that particular night. So just those types of things. And then as a 16-year-old, I had a tonsillectomy at a small private hospital. And I found myself waking up in the recovery room. And I remember sitting up in the bed and stepping out onto the floor and turning around, and there was my body. And I was like, oh crap, what is going on? There I am, but I'm standing here. And all I could think of was, I need to get back in my body. But I was unable to. I just kept walking around the table and thinking, that's me. What am I doing? I'm outside my body, and so I managed finally to like crawl up on the bed, and I remember lying back into my body, and the next conscious memory I had was I wake up, I'm in my hospital room, and again my whole family's standing over me, the doctor's there, the nurses there, and my older sister started crying, and evidently they had had a really difficult time waking me up from the anesthesia. I was a pretty small kid, and I don't know if they over medicated me, and the out of body experience, was brought on by that maybe too much anesthesia. But the only thing I could think of to ask was, are there mirrors in the recovery room? And that's what I managed to ask the nurse. And she was like, no, dear, there aren't any mirrors in the recovery room. And I was like, okay. So that was my first out of body experience, was as a 16-year-old. Then as a I was about 33, I had a near-death experience. I'd had a duodenal ulcer, history of a duodenal ulcer for several years. But I was finishing up graduate school. I was under a lot of stress. Was waiting tables at the time, working double shifts and working my way through school. And my ulcer was just killing me. Mm-hmm. And it was a Friday night, and I just wanted to finish out my shift, and get home and get my ulcer medicine. But around 10 o'clock that evening, I felt sort of a pop in my stomach, and the pain stopped. And I was like, oh, cool, I'm not hurting anymore. I can finish out my shift. And so I'm, got home, and the next day I felt sort of sick on my stomach, but I just thought I had a little stomach bug and tried not to pay much attention to it, because I had dinner reservations that evening at a really nice French restaurant, and I didn't want to miss it. My husband and I, we were going to meet some other people, and we'd had this plan for, several weeks. So I thought, well, even though I don't feel well, I'm going to go to this dinner. And so for dinner, I had duck with this red cherry sauce, and I had some red wine. But when I got home, I got sick, and what appeared to be blood, I just kind of chalked it up to the cherry sauce and the red wine, trying to rationalize, this isn't blood, this is just what I had for dinner. I even asked my husband, what do you think? And he said, yeah, it's probably just, the red wine. So went to bed, and the next morning around 6 o'clock, this would have been Sunday morning, my husband got up to go to a flea market, and I was just incredibly thirsty. All I could think about was a big glass of Coca-Cola. And he went downstairs. I remember getting out of bed and calling down to him to bring back a Coke, on his way back in. And I turned to go into the bathroom, and that's the last thing I remember. He heard me collapse, and found me unconscious on the floor. Um, Actually, my eyes were open and fixed, and I wasn't breathing. And so he picked me up, put me on the bed, did CPR, but I was gone. I went to the most beautiful place. The experience started out, I was on the edge of the side of a valley, like standing up on a mountain looking down into an incredibly green valley. And off in the distance, way off in the distance, were snow-capped mountains on the other side of the valley. But in the center of the valley was a huge tree, and it it spoke to me as the tree of life. I just felt like this is the tree of life. And as soon as I had those thoughts, I was actually under the tree. Um, and it was like a scene out of Bambi. There were animals, nothing but animals there. Birds, deer, exotic animals, every animal you could think of, rabbits hopping around. And just the sound was just beautiful. All of these animals making sounds, and the colors were just, I can't describe them. They were indescribable. Just beautiful colors, and just the feeling of peace that I've never felt before. And in the midst of these animals was my Rottweiler. She had died the previous Thursday as a 14-year-old dog, and I was with her when she died. But under this tree and this experience, she looked like she was about 2 or 3 again, a young dog. She was happy, healthy, wagging her tail. I could feel her head under my hands, and I was talking to her, and she was so happy to see me. I was happy to see her. And, I tell people it was almost like the Rainbow Bridge, the place you think about where, animals are supposed to go. But off in the distance, I could hear my husband calling me. And he kept calling and calling. And I was really getting angry because he was messing this experience up for me. I didn't want to come back. But finally, I gave in to
That's generally what husbands do.
Yeah. But I finally gave into his voice, and then I kind of rushed up, like through a tunnel, and I opened my eyes, and he said, "Don't move, the ambulance is on the way." And what happened was that Friday night, when I felt that sort of that pop in my stomach and the pain stopped, a vessel actually burst. And I had been bleeding for about 36 hours, and I didn't know it. And that's when I'd actually thrown blood up, that Saturday night.
Yeah.
So I lost over half my blood volume. I had to be transfused. I was in intensive care for about 5 days, and they actually coded me a couple of times after I got to the hospital. And, afterwards, friends would come to see me, and they said, "Well, did you go through a tunnel? Did you see deceased relatives?" And I was like, "No, but I had a great, just a wonderful dream." And because it didn't fit the paradigm of all the near-death experiences that I'd heard about. People always talked about going through a tunnel and seeing deceased relatives or friends. And I was in this beautiful green valley with animals. But it was about a year later, as I was watching an edition of Oprah, and she had people on her show who had had near-death experiences. And the majority had the tunnel and the deceased relatives experience, but one woman had the exact same experience that I had. She'd gone to this beautiful valley with a tree, and experienced the animals. So I was like, okay, this is the exact same experience I had. So it was a near-death experience. And I always felt like it was.
I'd like to make mention, if you don't mind, real quick. I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'd like to make mention that my uncle had a near-death experience very similar to yours as well. He was in a valley as well, and it was a valley with gold. There was a beautiful, brilliant light towards the end of this valley, or somewhere, and there was golden plants and flowers and stuff like that, and Very kind of similar to. I don't remember if there's animals, but you're not the first person I've heard mention seeing pets. Favorite pet. You must have been. I would imagine you were somewhat close with that Rottweiler.
Oh yeah, yeah,
There
very
is your
close.
baby, right?
Yeah,
Right. Well, you're not the first person. I've read a lot of accounts and testimonies of near-death experiences over the years, and yours is actually quite similar to some of the other ones I've heard. But please continue.
yeah. Thank you. That's good to know, and I haven't read since that time other accounts that were similar to mine. So it's not always, the paradigm of going through a tunnel and just seeing the deceased people. Um, so, and just, this house that I currently live in, I've been here about 40 years. And from the day I moved in, paranormal activity was happening. And my husband and his daughter told me, this house is haunted. Well, it dates to about 1890, but the original structure that was a log building that sat next door to this house dated to the 1700s, to the Revolutionary War era. So the land itself has a lot of history. And it's funny that this house also is over an artesian river. I do dowsing, and I've dowsed the points of energy around this property. And we've talked to previous occupants who told us that there's a river of water under this house. But I've actually dowsed it and marked it, and the energy systems cross in my living room. So I think that sets this home up for a lot of activity. And I know there's a great water source on this property because I have a 350-year-old oak tree in my front yard that's about 50 feet tall. It's a treasured tree within the state of North Carolina. It's got a certificate. And so it has to have an incredible water source to have grown that large. So I think that is conducive to the activity that I've experienced in this home, and that's full body apparitions, orbs, disembodied voices. My husband thinks I'm calling him. I think he's calling me, and we find out neither one of us has said anything. We always, we hear our names. I've done interviews like this when I talk about these things and the lights start flashing. So don't be surprised if something like that were to happen. But I also had paranormal activity in the home where I grew up as a child. In addition to the sort of the ET stuff, there was paranormal activity. So I seem to be kind of a magnet for it, or I just find myself living in these locations, that's conducive to this type of activity. And having, the out of body, and I did have quite a bit of, I don't know if it was astral travel or out of body in the 80s. I would find myself, I was working double shifts a lot, working my way through school. And so I would come home and take a nap. And I would find myself out in the yard walking around. And I would think, what am I doing out here? I'm napping. Why am I outside? And I would think, I need to get back inside and finish my nap so I can get ready for work. And I would get back in my body. And this would happen over and over. I have this ability to easily leave my body for some reason under the right circumstances. And then in 1989, I came home from work. It was probably, again, I have a lot of stuff happen to me like in June for some reason. But it was a June evening, about 1989. My husband had gotten home. He was renovating a historic building. So I said, go take a shower and I'm going to check the mail. So I walk outside onto the walkway, and it's probably about 7 o'clock on this June evening, not yet dark. And I feel a real heavy presence over me. I just sensed that there was something above me. So I looked up, and about 500 feet above that massive oak tree sat one of those huge black triangular crafts that we've all heard about. There was a rash of sightings of those in the 80s all over the world, but it was that obligatory, gigantic, black triangular craft just sitting there, making no sound, just sitting there above this giant oak tree. And it filled the entire sky. I mean, I cannot explain how huge it was. People say, football field or whatever. I'm terrible with distance, but it filled the entire sky. I'm standing there screaming for my husband, which we have a long front porch and the door was open, but he was in the shower. He couldn't hear me. I'm not sure how long I stood there. And again, in the blink of that eye, just like when I was a kid, this craft just shot southward and was gone.
Wow.
Um,
No noise, no noise, or
no, no noise, nothing. So I stayed up that night and to watch the 11 o'clock news. I thought for sure there's going to be something on the news about this craft. No one in my area reported it. There was nothing on the local news. They made mention of a UFO being spotted in Salisbury, North Carolina. Well, that's directly south of here, and that's the direction the craft flew in. So at least someone in Salisbury reported seeing something. But I thought, it wasn't even dark, and I live off of a fairly busy road on a circle. And I thought, how could, with all this traffic, how could it not be seen? It was massive, sitting above this oak tree. But, I've heard that sometimes they're only seen by people who are supposed to see them. And, maybe no one else was supposed to see it. But the next evening I went back out and I was looking for it. I was hoping that it would come back. Well, I saw two little boys walking up the circle and they're looking upward. And I was like, hey, what are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for that UFO we saw last night.
Oh, wow.
So they had seen it. They were probably about 11 or 12. Well, what's really interesting, a year later, I was starting graduate school and I was having the sort of meet and greet with the department head of anthropology. And he saw my address. He said, wow, I just moved out of that neighborhood. He said, my son and I lived down on the corner in the brick house on the circle. And he said, my little boy was the little redheaded kid. I said, yeah. I said, I remember your son. He said, did you know my kid saw a UFO when he lived on the circle? I said, so that was your son. So I had validation from the head of the anthropology department in graduate school that his son had seen that UFO. And we spoke about that probably 20 years later when I saw him again. We talked about that. So that was good that I at least had validation, from someone else that, that was a real event. But it was just amazing that no one else saw it but us and myself and those two little boys. So, just this crazy life of paranormal activity, UFO activity. And also as a teenager, I studied a lot of astrology, numerology, tarot cards, palm reading. I was very interested in all of those things. I think primarily because of the things that had happened to me as a child. But also the 70s were conducive to that sort of thing. I was a hippie. I liked the Grateful Dead,
Me too.
those kinds of bands.
Pink Floyd, The Dead, The Doors. Those are my favorite bands.
Oh, yeah. So I had, friends that were very open-minded, and we were all sort of part of this cosmic consciousness, and, in seeking higher consciousness through substances. There were a lot of experimentations during that time with psychedelics, magic mushrooms, psilocybin. So I was always exploring ways to heighten my consciousness. But I've left those days behind and sought out higher consciousness as an adult through meditation and shamanism. And I had a great professor in college that trained me in the Michael Harner method of shamanic communication. And Michael Harner lived with the Amazonian Indians off and on for decades, and had the Michael Harner School for Shamanism, and it is operating in San Francisco. He's passed away. So I was certified in Michael Harner method, and have led groups, and it really is possible, through the drumming, which, the shaman drumming taps into the let's see, there's the beta, alpha, theta. It taps into the theta brain waves and can actually alter your consciousness and help you identify your power animal. That's the purpose, to get out into the spirit world. Mm-hmm. So, I practiced that, and I became trained in healing touch, past life regression, age and womb regression, hypnotherapy. I've just sought other ways to connect with a higher consciousness pretty much my entire life. But beginning in the early 2000s, I decided to sort of formalize all of those interests as a paranormal investigator. That's when a lot of, TV shows started coming on about, ghost investigations. And I had experienced these things throughout my life, and I really wasn't afraid living here and having all of this activity, primarily because of having encountered those two beings as a 10-year-old. Nothing scared me at that point. So I was more curious, not about, the scare factor, but how are these spirits or entities or beings, how are they coming through? How are they communicating? How do they do this? There's got to be some science behind what's happening with this phenomena. So I thought, what better way to explore than to, become a paranormal investigator? And at that time, there was a lot of, equipment coming on the market, the spirit boxes, digital recorders, magnetic, yep. Your EMF recorders, measuring temperatures, mel meters, all those kinds of things. So, of course, I ordered, my little toolkit, and I formalized a group, Spirit Hunters of the South, in 2007 with my best friend. And we investigated areas all around North Carolina for about 3 years. But she had a small child, and that's pretty demanding work. It requires travel.
It is very demanding.
You review the audio and the photographic evidence afterwards, and that's something that you really have to take your time doing. And she had a little girl and really couldn't dedicate the time that was required. And at that point, I wanted to branch out beyond my state, and go to other areas to investigate. So my stepdaughter, Ashley, who had lived in this home and experienced a lot of paranormal activity as a child, she joined my team. Even though she lived in Georgia, we decided, hey, we can meet up, in locations. She would meet me in South Carolina. I'd meet her in Georgia, and we traveled to Florida and even up into areas up north. And So we formalized our Spirit Hunters of the South into a business and formed an LLC and began investigating all up and down the East Coast. And, in the beginning, we really just went to historic locations, plantations, historic properties, and had a lot of success communicating with the populations on the land. And with my anthropology and archaeology degrees, I ended up applying the archaeological approach to these historic sites, almost like an archaeological dig. We would go in and uncover every layer of habitation, many times taking these sites back to like the late 1600s with the original land grant from King George. And we would layer ourselves up through the history by exploring genealogy, talking to management on site. And the spirits seemed to really like that we knew about them, because we would go in and ask questions, and they were very willing to answer our questions and communicate with us. And we even had management at some of these locations that are open to the public. They would say, we have, a building that we're not sure what it was used for. Will you find out? And so we would ask the spirits and they would tell us. And on the back end, we were able to research or talk to local people who could validate the information that came through from these historic timelines. And so we just uncovered incredible information. But, that just made me question even further, how can they communicate with us? And these EVPs were so clear, like, they're just standing right next to us. But clearly they're coming through from another timeline in history. So I started looking into quantum theory, special and general relativity, Einstein's theories, and then of course quantum mechanics is built on that, and string theory and multiverse. And so a lot of those theories really kind of make sense when you start applying it to these timelines, that all time exists at the same time. There's no past, present, or future. We're just tapping in to these adjacent timelines. So over time, what we found, not only coming through were these historic timelines, we began receiving interstellar and interdimensional communication. They were saying they were coming through portals and wormholes. They were telling us their dimension's name, their planet's name. They would question us about being human. Are you human? And, we could hear some of these things in real time. I don't know what your experience has been, but oftentimes we didn't think we were getting anything. And then when you review, you realize you're getting a lot of communication. So you don't always hear these things come through in real time, but sometimes we did, and we could hear portal, we could hear wormhole. And so we started asking additional questions, and that's when we started getting the planet's name, the dimension's name, and those kinds of things. So that really put us on a path of quantum theory. And
wow, that's incredible, Pam. The funny thing about what you're talking about right now, about over 15 years ago, when I started researching the paranormal and parapsychology in general, I kept going towards quantum physics. I mean, I went looking for it. It just led me right to it. And then years and years later, many years later, when I read Dr. Barry Taft's book, Aliens Above, Ghosts Below, And he goes into a lot about these quantum mechanics and science, where the fabric of space and time and gravity, you have space, time, and gravity is like a semiotic triangle. And when whatever affects one of them, it affects the other two because of their relation. Um, and then when we're talking about time as a fabric,
Right.
he said in his book, and this makes total sense, that as far as time goes, the things that happened in the past, present, future are all data on a cosmic hard drive of sorts.
Right.
Are you familiar with that concept?
Oh yeah, that would be has been referred to down through millennia as the Akashic records. You know, um, that goes so far back into the history of humankind on the planet, that there's a repository of information out there, a consciousness that we can tap into. And, many theorize that that's what Einstein tapped into, Tesla, because they admitted they were tapping into information that they didn't know where it was coming from. Einstein was not that good of a student. He started out as an accountant, I think, or in some lower level job. And then
I think he was a patent clerk.
patent clerk, that's what it was. Yeah. And then, within about a year, he wrote, his first relativity theory. So, he would sit for like 8 hours a day and have these daydreams, is what he called them. What was he tapping into? It was this collective consciousness that is exactly what you just referred to.
Wow. I think this is a good point for us to take a break. But when we come back, listen, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this, and maybe we talk a little bit what happened at Cape Fear, and
Sure.
anything else you want that's on your heart and mind to discuss. This is Pam Nance on Project Stargate, a special edition of Project Stargate. We'll be right back.